There are crimes that shock a nation, crimes that fracture the way people see family, loyalty, and trust. But then, there are crimes that go even deeper, crimes that challenge the very idea of what a human being can do to those who raise them. Tonight's story is not about mystery. It's not about a killer hiding in the shadows. It's not even about revenge or desperation. This is a story about a plan, a deliberate, structured, chilling plan, carried out inside the home of a wealthy, respected family in São Paulo. A plan orchestrated not by an outsider, not by a stranger, but by the daughter who lived under that very roof. The case of Suzanne von Richthofen is one of the most disturbing, analyzed, and controversial crimes in Brazilian history. A crime that ignited debates about privilege, manipulation, psychology, and the limits of human coldness. And even decades later, it remains one of the most haunting domestic tragedies ever recorded. In this video, we will dive deep into the full story. From childhood to relationships, from planning to execution, from investigation to trial, everything in clear detail, using real events, interviews, and reports as foundation, but without glamorizing anything. This is a long, complex narrative. And like every true crime story, it is not meant to sensationalize, but to inform, analyze, and understand how something like this could happen. So sit back, because what you're about to hear is not just a crime. It's a collapse of a family from the inside. This is the story of Suzanne von Richthofen. Chapter 1. The family behind the tragedy. Early life, family structure, background, approximately 700 words. To understand the magnitude of what happened, we need to start where it all began. Inside one of the most stable, respected homes in São Paulo's upper middle-class society. The von Richthofen family was seen as structured, disciplined, and successful. The father, Manfred von Richthofen, was a respected engineer, known for his intelligence and work ethic. The mother, Maricia, was a psychiatrist, a calm, soft-spoken woman dedicated to her career and her children. They owned a comfortable home. They provided excellent education. They offered stability, opportunities, and a life without financial struggle. Their daughter, Suzanne Louise von Richthofen, was born into privilege. Private schools, access to extracurricular activities, fluent English, trips, the kind of environment where children have every opportunity to grow safely. Those who knew her described her as a regular girl growing up, not rebellious, not problematic, not aggressive. She had friends, she was social, she was considered polite. There was nothing in those early years that suggested she would later become the center of one of Brazil's most shocking murder cases. Her younger brother, Andreas, was extremely intelligent, later revealed to be gifted and academically advanced. The siblings had a functional relationship, normal for their ages. By all visible measures, the von Richthofen family represented stability and success. But as in many tragic stories, what was visible on the outside did not fully reflect what was happening behind closed doors, especially as Suzanne entered adolescence and began seeking independence, identity, and emotional autonomy. The story takes its first turn with a seemingly simple, ordinary moment in high school, when she meets a boy who would change everything. The relationship that altered everything. Introduction to Daniel and Christian, dynamics, emotional dependency, approximately 800 words. Around the age of 15 or 16, Suzanne meets Daniel Cravinhos, a boy from a very different social world. While her family was wealthy, structured, and academically driven, Daniel's life was simpler, more casual, and without the strict expectations that governed the von Richthofen household. Daniel was older than Suzanne. He lived with his family in a less privileged environment. He was passionate about motorcycles, martial arts, fantasy themes, and role-playing games. And for Suzanne, who had grown up under rigid discipline and social expectations, Daniel represented something new: freedom, rebellion, and emotional intensity. Complicating things further, Daniel had a younger brother, Christian, who lived in the same house. The Cravinhos brothers spent much of their time working on motorcycles, experimenting with martial arts, and immersing themselves in hobbies that felt thrilling and unconventional to Suzanne. To her, this world felt alive. To her parents, it felt dangerous. The von Richthofens strongly disapproved of Daniel, not because of prejudice, but because of how fast the relationship escalated. They feared that Daniel was a bad influence and that the romance was pulling Suzanne away from school, responsibilities, and long-term goals. Arguments escalated. The once peaceful household became tense, revolving around one issue: Suzanne's relationship with Daniel. The more her parents opposed it, the more determined she became to continue. This emotional war created a dangerous dynamic of rebellion, dependency, and secrecy. Suzanne began spending more time away from home, lying about where she was, and depending more on Daniel emotionally. But this wasn't just a normal teenage romance. According to investigators and psychological analysts, the relationship began to take on a pattern of codependency, where both partners fed into the idea of us against the world. The more her parents tried to protect her, the more she felt victimized, the more she saw them as obstacles to her new life. And soon, an idea, initially small, irrational, and unbelievable, began forming inside the minds of those involved. An idea that, instead of being rejected, was fed, nurtured, and eventually put into action. The first talks of a crime. As the tension grew, the arguments intensified. Suzanne felt controlled and judged. Daniel felt rejected by her family and unwanted inside a world he didn't belong to. And sometime during these heated months, conversations shifted from complaints and frustrations to something darker. The idea of what if they were gone started as a hypothetical scenario, at least according to some accounts. But the problem with fantasies, especially dangerous ones, is that they can evolve when the environment encourages it. And this relationship, wrapped in rebellion and emotional dependency, created the perfect atmosphere for dangerous ideas to grow. Suzanne began expressing resentment toward her parents. She complained that they limited her freedom, monitored her computer use, questioned her every decision, and tried to pull her away from Daniel. She framed herself as a victim, trapped by strict parents who didn't understand her. Daniel, in turn, reinforced her frustrations. He fed the narrative that she deserved independence, deserved to choose her own life, and shouldn't be treated like a child. What started as emotional venting evolved into discussions about money, inheritance, and escape. Because the von Richthofen family had money, a lot of it. And this became part of the fantasy. A life together, financially secure, free from the restrictions of her parents. In these conversations, there were doubts, moments of hesitation, and hesitation again. But little by little, a boundary was crossed. A line that, once crossed, would lead to irreversible consequences. And the people involved began not just imagining a scenario without her parents, but actively planning one. The next step in this narrative is where everything becomes colder, more structured, and more disturbing, as the plan moves from idea to execution. As weeks turned into months, the conversations that once sounded impossible began to take the shape of something disturbingly real. The emotional storm between Suzanne and her parents wasn't calming down. Instead, it fed a growing sense of rebellion, frustration, and justification inside her mind. What had started as hypothetical talk, the kind of dark exaggerations people sometimes make when angry, slowly became a structured plan. And it wasn't just a plan born of impulse, but one shaped over time, discussed repeatedly, and refined to the point of chilling detail. There were two central motivations driving this deadly idea. 1. Emotional autonomy, a desire to live freely with Daniel without rules. 2. Financial motivation, the inheritance and assets the parents would leave behind. This combination, freedom and money, created a dangerous foundation. The Crevignos brothers, Daniel and Christian, became increasingly involved in these talks. Christian, the younger brother, had no personal conflict with the von Richthofens, but he was close to Daniel, loyal to him, and drawn into the fantasy of a new life funded by the inheritance they imagined Suzanne would receive. It's important to emphasize, there was no single moment where the plan became official. It grew slowly, piece by piece, until everyone involved stopped treating it as an outrageous possibility and started treating it as a task. The group began analyzing the family routine, the security systems, the layout of the house, the sleeping patterns, how to enter without raising suspicion, what weapon to use, and how to stage the crime scene to look like a robbery, the plan became disturbingly strategic. According to the investigation, the idea was to make the murder look like a break-in committed by unknown criminals. This way, suspicion wouldn't point toward the daughter, and the legal process for inheritance would be straightforward. The brothers decided to use metal bars, blunt, silent, and lethal weapons. Guns would be loud, knives might leave too much trace or allow victims to fight back. Metal clubs were chosen with cold calculation. The plan also called for disabling the alarm system from inside the house. Only Suzanne could do this. She knew the passwords, the routines, and the blind spots that intruders would never know. As this planning grew more detailed, something even more unsettling happened. Suzanne began living her daily life as if nothing was wrong. She had dinner with her parents. She watched TV with them. She participated in normal family routines, all while knowing that a plan to end their lives was already being scheduled. This duality, acting as the loving daughter while planning their deaths, is one of the elements that shocked Brazil the most. It's not the impulsive, desperate act seen in many crimes. It's the prolonged coexistence with the victims while plotting their downfall. And by the time the final days arrived, each part of the plan was already rehearsed in their minds. The date was chosen, the steps aligned, the roles defined. All that remained was execution. The night of the crime, what happened hour by hour, approximately 1,200 words, the night of October 31st, 2002, ironically Halloween, began like any other. Nothing about the day suggested the tragedy that was about to unfold. Earlier that evening, Suzanne accompanied her parents at home, maintaining the same calm behavior that had concealed her intentions for weeks. Investigators later described her demeanor as unnervingly normal. 9 p.m. The departure. To make the plan run smoothly, Suzanne needed to leave the house. She told her parents she would go out with Daniel for a while. This was not suspicious. Her parents assumed she was simply meeting her boyfriend. What they didn't know was that she was leaving with Daniel and Christian for the specific purpose of finalizing the plan. The trio drove together through São Paulo, discussing last-minute details: how to enter, when to strike, what each person would do, how to behave afterward. At one point, according to later statements, the brothers expressed hesitation. But they proceeded anyway. A mix of pressure, commitment, and the emotional bubble they had built together. 11 p.m., waiting for the house to fall asleep. Having left the house earlier, Suzanne returned alone around this time. Her job was to confirm her parents were asleep, disable the alarm, open the main door for the brothers inside the house. Everything was dark and quiet. Her parents had gone to bed hours earlier. She moved normally calmly, in a way that would not draw suspicion. When she confirmed the house was silent, she walked outside again. 11:30 p.m., arrival of Daniel and Christian. The brothers arrived on their motorcycle and parked at a discreet distance. Suzanne opened the door for them and guided them inside. Before entering the parents' bedroom area, the trio made sure all internal lights were off. By this point, everyone had a defined role. Daniel, primary attacker. Christian, assistant in overpowering the victims. Suzanne, access, staging, destruction of evidence. 11:50 p.m., entering the parents' bedroom. The brothers moved down the hallway toward the master bedroom where Manfred and Mauricio were sleeping. Suzanne stayed in the living room, avoiding direct involvement in the physical attack. But she was not distant. She was within the house, listening, waiting. When Daniel and Christian entered the bedroom, the attack began immediately. The attack. The brothers used metal bars, striking the sleeping couple multiple times. The scene was brutal, chaotic, and horrifying. Manfred attempted to defend himself, but the surprise and violence of the attack prevented any real resistance. Mauricio was struck as she tried to react, unable to process what was happening in time. Forensic reports later concluded that both were rendered unconscious quickly but suffered multiple blows beyond that point. When Manfred was still showing signs of life, one of the brothers placed a towel in his mouth to prevent noise, a detail that investigators would later find disturbing and exceptionally cold. In the middle of the attack, something even more chilling occurred. According to statements and forensic reconstruction, Suzanne entered the hallway near the bedroom during the assault, listening to her parents' final moments. She didn't intervene. She didn't call for help. She waited. 12:20 a.m. Staging the scene. With the couple dead, the brothers and Suzanne immediately moved on to the next step, staging the crime scene as a burglary. They ransacked drawers. They threw objects on the floor. They took small items, jewelry, electronics, to make the scene seem realistic. They broke open a safe, but left behind valuable items in an inconsistent way. One of the most disturbing details, they placed a towel over Mauricia's head, a sign of coldness often described in forensic psychology. 12:50 a.m., leaving the house. After staging the scene, the brothers left the house first, taking the murder weapons with them. Suzanne stayed behind a few minutes to finish the last details, including removing fingerprints from surfaces, turning off lights, ensuring nothing tied the scene back to her. Then she left, driving her car to meet the brothers again. 1:30 a.m., the alibi begins. From this point on, the trio began acting out the script they had prepared. They went to an internet cafe to be seen in public, then returned home to discover the supposed robbery. Suzanne arrived at the house with Daniel panicking on purpose, acting hysterical. All part of the performance. She called the police, crying and screaming, claiming she had found her parents murdered. The show had begun, but investigators would soon discover inconsistencies, and the perfect crime would crumble faster than they expected. When police and emergency personnel arrived at the von Richthofen residence, it was close to 3 a.m. The atmosphere was tense, chaotic, and strange from the moment the front door opened. The officers had seen countless crime scenes over their careers, but something about this one felt off. At first glance, it did appear like a burglary. Drawers were open, some items were missing, objects were scattered across the floor. But experienced investigators know the difference between a chaotic struggle and a staged mess, and this scene lacked the natural disorder of a genuine home invasion. One of the first red flags was the absence of forced entry. The locks weren't broken, windows weren't shattered, doors weren't damaged. For someone to stage a break-in, they had forgotten the most basic detail: breaking in. Still, no one jumped to conclusions immediately. Investigators know that shock can distort memory. Victims under stress can forget details, misinterpret signs, or behave unusually. But the second red flag appeared almost instantly, and it came from Suzanne herself. Her behavior. While she cried and appeared distraught, officers noted her emotional display felt inconsistent. At times, she seemed overly dramatic, as if performing grief rather than experiencing it. At other moments, she would suddenly become calm, collected, and oddly rational. One officer described her behavior as oscillating between theatrical crying and complete emotional detachment. She walked around the house, pointing things out, explaining what she had found, but seemed strangely composed for someone whose parents had just been brutally murdered. Even stranger, she didn't show fear that the supposed intruders might still be nearby. She moved through the scene without hesitation. These subtle behavioral cues don't solve crimes, but they rarely go unnoticed. Daniel's behavior. Daniel Kreviños also raised suspicion almost immediately. Rather than focusing on the tragedy, he seemed more interested in Suzanne than in the situation. His emotional responses appeared rehearsed, misaligned with the gravity of two brutal murders. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't ask if anyone else could be in danger. He didn't express fear or confusion. He simply stayed close to Suzanne. Investigators took note of all of this, silently, without accusations. But suspicions had already begun forming. Inconsistencies in the burglary. A forensic team arrived soon after and started analyzing the room where the bodies were found. The scene told a very different story than the one in Suzanne's initial statements. Key inconsistencies included valuable items left untouched, such as expensive electronics and jewelry, drawers messily opened, but with items still neatly placed inside, suggesting they were pulled out only for show. The safe, partially open in a way that didn't match forced entry techniques. The bodies, positioned in a way that suggested a personal, targeted attack rather than a random robbery gone wrong. Forensic investigators recognized patterns. Robbers typically flee when confronted. They don't stay long enough to commit prolonged, violent murders, and they almost never use metal bars, a weapon usually connected to personal, intimate crimes. This didn't feel like a burglary. It felt like something else. The daughter who didn't ask questions. Throughout the entire first night, Suzanne asked remarkably few questions. She didn't ask how her parents died. She didn't ask whether her brother was safe. She didn't ask if the killers might come back. She didn't ask about what happens next or if she needed protection. Her focus seemed strangely narrow, centered on herself, on Daniel, and on directing police attention toward the burglary narrative. One officer would later state confidentially that in his experience, children who lose their parents to violent crime behave in one of two ways: overwhelming, paralyzing shock, with confusion, disbelief, and fear. Extreme panic mixed with frantic questioning, wanting to understand every detail, but Suzanne did neither. Her behavior followed an unusual third pattern: calmness mixed with performance. Bit by bit, suspicion grew. The first interview. Later that same morning, investigators conducted formal interviews with Suzanne and Daniel separately. They expected heightened emotion. They expected shock. They expected disorientation. Instead, they found rehearsed-sounding answers matching stories between Suzanne and Daniel, lack of detail on key points, and strange emotional flatness. When asked to describe the night, Suzanne repeated the same phrasing multiple times, as if trying not to deviate from a script. Investigators tried gently leading her to tell events in her own words, but each time she circled back to the same practiced lines. This was another red flag, not evidence, but a deepening suspicion. The detail that changed everything. During the initial investigation, police discovered something critical. The home alarm system had been turned off manually, from inside the house. There was no forced entry, no tampering, no damage to the keypad. Someone with access had disabled it, and only two people had access to that code: the parents and their daughter. This was the first concrete thread that suggested the crime was an inside job, and investigators began quietly reevaluating every detail of what they had seen so far. Chapter 7. Small mistakes, big consequences, contradictions, the Trevino's brothers crack, financial motives emerge, approximately 900 words. While police continued processing the crime scene, another part of the investigation was already underway: a background check on everyone involved. And the more they learned about Suzanne and her relationship with the Trevino's brothers, the more suspicious the entire situation appeared. A relationship marked by conflict. When investigators interviewed friends, neighbors, and relatives, the picture became clearer. The parents had strongly disapproved of Daniel. They had tried to limit the relationship. They had argued with Suzanne frequently because of him. The girl had expressed anger, resentment, and frustration. The couple had discussed separating her from Daniel entirely. This gave investigators what every investigation looks for early: motive. A strong one. A sudden shift in their lifestyle. Another alarm bell rang when detectives reviewed the financial aspects of the family. The von Richthofens were wealthy, and their assets included property, investments, vehicles, and a considerable amount of money. Suzanne, as the oldest child, would receive a significant portion of that wealth. Investigators noticed something else. Right after the murders, Suzanne and Daniel behaved as though money was suddenly not a concern. They discussed travel plans, purchased new items, talked openly about future financial freedom, behaved in ways that didn't fit with the tragedy that had just occurred. One investigator later said, "It was as if they were planning the next chapter of their life," before the funeral had even happened. The first major slip-up: Christian's behavior. While Daniel tried to stay composed, Christian was not as emotionally controlled. During the early stages of the investigation, a police officer noticed Christian's nervousness. His hands shook. He avoided making eye contact. He spoke quickly and contradicted himself in minor details. Small contradictions aren't enough to arrest someone, but they are enough to keep asking questions. Days after the murder, the Trevino's brothers bought a new motorcycle, paying in cash. This raised suspicion because neither brother had that kind of money available prior to the murder. Where did the money come from? The brothers claimed they had saved it, but their lifestyle and employment history didn't support that story. This led investigators to quietly consider the possibility that money from the crime, or connected to the motive, had already been used. Another problem: the staging was poorly done. Forensic analysts continued dissecting the crime scene, and the more they studied it, the clearer it became that the burglary explanation was flawed. Problems included the lack of signs of struggle, the organized placement of items, the calm way drawers were opened, the unrealistic mess that didn't match typical burglar behavior, towels placed over the victims, the choice of weapon, the selective removal of certain objects but not others. It looked like a performance, one made by people who didn't fully understand how real criminals behave. Investigators recognized the telltale signs of a staged crime committed by amateurs. Then came the final problem: the brother. As police checked more records, they learned more about Andreas, Suzanne's younger brother. He had not been in the house during the attack. He was safe. And when police interviewed him carefully, something became clear: his relationship with his parents was stable and loving. There was no motive from him. He had no involvement. He was devastated, genuinely devastated, and he had no idea what his sister had planned. This eliminated the possibility of a family-planned crime. If anything, it painted Suzanne in a more suspicious light. The police decided to increase pressure. Investigators finally realized something crucial. They didn't need a confession. They needed a mistake. And mistakes were beginning to pile up. So detectives began applying pressures, gently, subtly, strategically. They re-interviewed each person separately. They looked for inconsistencies. They asked emotional questions. They challenged timelines. They confronted each person with small contradictory details. They watched body language. They monitored reactions. And eventually, someone cracked. Not Suzanne, not Daniel, Christian. The confessions begin. Christian was the weakest link from the start. Nervous, uncomfortable, unable to maintain a consistent story under pressure. Days into the investigation, while speaking to police again, Christian began showing signs of emotional collapse. Sweating, trembling, answering questions too quickly, correcting himself repeatedly. Then detectives delivered the final push. They revealed they had evidence connecting the brothers to the staged burglary. They hinted they knew about the motorcycle. They pointed out inconsistencies in Christian's timeline. And Christian broke. He confessed. Not partially, not indirectly. He confessed everything. He explained the plan, he described the roles, he detailed the weapons, he exposed the staging. He revealed Suzanne's full involvement. Once Christian confessed, everything else collapsed like dominoes. Daniel was confronted with Christian's statements and with the mounting evidence. And after initial resistance, he confessed too, confirming nearly every detail. When faced with the confessions of both brothers and with the unraveling of her own story, Suzanne finally confessed as well. The truth was now clear. The planning, the motive, the execution, the staging, the alibi. Everything had been meticulously orchestrated, and everything had now fallen apart. For investigators, the case was solved. But for the public, the shock was only beginning. When news broke that Suzanne von Richthofen, the daughter of the victims, had confessed to participating in the murder of her own parents, Brazil reacted with disbelief. It was one of those moments in national history where time seems to freeze. People didn't just hear about the case, they reacted to it emotionally, viscerally. This wasn't a distant story. This wasn't an obscure crime. This was a wealthy, well-educated young woman from a respected family, someone raised in comfort with every opportunity available, accused of planning and facilitating the cold-blooded murder of her parents. It defied the traditional narratives people were used to. It challenged assumptions about family, privilege, and morality. And it struck at something deeply cultural: the sanctity of the parent-child relationship. For many Brazilians, the idea of a daughter killing her parents was beyond comprehension, and the media knew it. The media storm. Within hours of the confession, headlines across the country exploded. Daughter helps murder parents. Crime of the upper-class rich. Air plots death of her own family. A perfect life with a hidden secret. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Newspapers printed special editions. Reporters camped outside the police station for days. The public devoured every detail. Suzanne's calm demeanor, her relationship with Daniel, the brothers' confessions, the attack with metal bars, the staged burglary, the financial motives, the inheritance. It wasn't just news, it became a national obsession. The shock factor. The intensity of the reaction was due to several factors. 1. Social class violent crimes in Brazil often involve poverty, desperation, or gang activity. But this case involved wealth, privilege, and calculated betrayal. It inverted expectations. 2. The coldness. The attack wasn't impulsive. It wasn't the result of a sudden fight. It was planned, discussed, rehearsed, and executed with chilling composure. 3. The daughter. Perhaps the most disturbing element was that Suzanne was not a bystander. She wasn't an accessory out of fear. She wasn't emotionally unstable in the traditional sense. She had orchestrated the entire plan. For many, that level of detachment was terrifying. 4. Her behavior video footage of Suzanne during the early investigation began circulating. Her calm tone, her straight posture, her emotional shifts, her attempt to act devastated. These clips fueled public outrage. Because in the eyes of many viewers, she didn't look like a grieving daughter. She looked like someone playing a role. The funeral. The von Richthofen funeral was held shortly after the bodies were released by the medical examiner. Family, friends, colleagues, and members of the local community gathered. And there, amidst the grief, something became painfully clear. Suzanne's behavior didn't match the setting. Witnesses noted her posture was almost relaxed. Her eyes wandered, unfocused. She didn't cry naturally. Tears came in controlled, deliberate moments. She comforted others more than they comforted her. She seemed detached from the tragedy. Some relatives felt uneasy around her. Others tried giving her the benefit of the doubt. Grief affects people differently. But those who had been following the case closely couldn't help noticing the glaring disconnect between the scene and her demeanor. While the coffins were lowered, friends of the family cried uncontrollably. Neighbors grieved. Relatives sobbed in shock. Suzanne remained strangely composed. When speaking to others, she expressed sadness, but always in calm, neatly structured sentences. Not once did she break down unexpectedly. Not once did she show the kind of raw emotion people expected from a daughter burying her parents. What no one at the funeral knew, at least not yet, was that Suzanne had already confessed her involvement. She was standing there, mourning publicly, while privately knowing what she had done. And the few who suspected something was off were right. The presence of Daniel. Another moment caused discomfort. Daniel attended the funeral. He kept a lower profile, but even so, his presence felt out of place. His connection to the case wasn't fully public yet, but investigators already knew he was involved. For those observing closely, the body language between Suzanne and Daniel was subtle, but present. They looked at each other more than expected. There was a closeness, almost a comfort, that didn't match the gravity of the setting. This created an atmosphere of tension. Within days, photographs from the funeral circulated in the media, and once the confessions became public, those images were reanalyzed endlessly by journalists and viewers. People saw them not as grieving partners, but as accomplices hiding in plain sight. While police built the legal case, psychologists, journalists, and criminologists began dissecting Suzanne's personality. What could drive a young woman, privileged, educated, intelligent, to orchestrate the murder of her own parents? This question dominated the national conversation. Theories emerged: manipulation and emotional dependency. Some suggested Daniel had manipulated Suzanne, controlling her emotionally and convincing her to act against her parents. But this theory weakened after the confessions, which showed Suzanne was actively involved in planning, not passively following. Desire for autonomy. Others argued she resented her parents' rules and wanted to live freely with Daniel. But this motive alone felt disproportionate to the crime. Financial gain investigators revealed that Suzanne would inherit a significant amount of money, a motive that added a cold layer of calculation to the case. Personality structure. Psychologists debated whether Suzanne exhibited traits of narcissism, lack of empathy, or emotional detachment. Some media outlets even insinuated she displayed psychopathic characteristics, though no official diagnosis was ever released publicly. What shocked professionals? Several elements stood out. The extended coexistence with her parents while knowing they were going to die. Her calm behavior before and after the murders. Her ability to lie convincingly at first. Her focus on the inheritance after the crime. These actions revealed not just planning, but emotional compartmentalization. The ability to separate her actions from any sense of guilt or empathy. Though psychologists cautioned against amateur diagnoses, one thing became clear: she was not emotionally overwhelmed by the crime in the way most offenders would be. The public interpreted this as evidence of something dark, something cold, something deeply unsettling. And this fed the media machine even more. With the confession secured, investigators moved to structure the legal narrative. Their goal was simple: build a case strong enough to withstand any retraction or strategy change from the defendants. The prosecution's approach. Prosecutors focused on key pillars. 1. Premeditation. This wasn't a spontaneous crime. It involved planning, scheduling, and detailed preparation. 2. Active participation. Suzanne wasn't a passive player. She used her knowledge of the house to enable the crime. She disabled the alarm. She opened the doors. She staged the scene. 3. Motive. The combination of romantic autonomy and financial gain created a compelling narrative of intent. 4. Confessions from all 3 defendants. Even if later disputed, these initial confessions were detailed and mutually consistent. The defense strategy. The defense, meanwhile, faced an impossible challenge. They attempted several approaches, claiming emotional manipulation by Daniel arguing she was vulnerable, naive, or pressured, presenting her as emotionally immature, highlighting her young age, 18 at the time of the crime. But these arguments clashed with the overwhelming evidence. She had planned. She had provided access. She had staged the crime. She had acted methodically. She had confessed. Still, the defense tried to paint her as someone overwhelmed by love, manipulated, controlled, and psychologically influenced. They emphasized her desire for independence. They suggested she saw no other way out of the conflict with her parents. They tried to introduce emotional nuance into a case dominated by cold logic. Public opinion. As the trial approached, public opinion split into 3 main groups. 1. The outraged majority. Those who believed she was cold, calculating, and deserving of the harshest punishment. 2. The sympathetic minority. Those who believed she was manipulated by Daniel and acted out of emotional dependence. 3. The neutral observers. Those who simply waited for the trial, aware that speculation couldn't replace the judicial process. But among investigators, prosecutors, and journalists, the consensus was strong. The evidence against Suzanne was overwhelming. The final preparations. In the months leading to the trial, forensic specialists refined their reports. Psychological evaluations were completed. Investigators ensured all confessions were documented. The timeline was reconstructed. The scene staging was explained, the motive was clarified. The prosecution prepared its narrative. The courtroom would soon become the stage where one of Brazil's most shocking crimes would unfold publicly. And the nation was waiting. Because if the investigation phase had shocked the country, the trial would do much more. By the morning of November 8, 2002, the pressure on all 3 suspects, Suzanne, Daniel, and Christian, had reached a critical point. Investigators had spent a full week analyzing the crime scene, reconstructing the timeline, matching inconsistencies, and testing every detail the trio had provided. Every day, the cracks grew wider. Detectives saw it in Suzanne's behavior, in Daniel's contradictions, and especially in Christian's nervousness. But what investigators didn't know yet was this: Christian Cravinhos was the weakest link. Not in intelligence, but in emotional resistance. Unlike Daniel, Christian didn't have a romantic attachment to Suzanne. He didn't have a future inheritance in mind. He wasn't invested in a new life built with her. He was simply the younger brother who had been pulled into the plan, driven by loyalty, money, and a distorted sense of opportunity. And now, face to face with the police, he was terrified. Detectives divided the trio into separate rooms and started applying psychological pressure, walking them through the timeline again and again, pointing out inconsistencies, showing photos, repeating details, and waiting for someone to break. It worked. After hours of interrogation, Christian began to sweat, tremble, and lose control of his calm facade. He asked for water repeatedly. He avoided eye contact. His voice wavered. When detectives pushed him with precision, presenting the inconsistencies in the burglary scenario and the timeline, Christian's expression changed. He realized they already knew the truth. All he needed was a nudge. And the detectives gave him exactly that. A simple line, delivered with calculated impact. "Christian, Suzanne already told us everything." It was a lie, but one investigators are legally allowed to use during interrogations in Brazil. And for Christian, it was devastating. He collapsed emotionally. Moments later, he whispered the words that broke the case open. "We did it." The confession flowed quickly. He admitted he and Daniel had killed the couple. He revealed that Suzanne had planned the entire crime. He described the attack in detail. He explained how she turned off the alarm, opened the door, and waited. He outlined the staging of the robbery. He exposed every step, every movement, and every intention. The more he talked, the more detectives realized the scale of the planning. Christian even reenacted the crime later that day, showing investigators where he stood, how the blows were struck, how the towel was used, how the safe was opened, how they exited the room, and how Suzanne behaved the entire time. For the detective team, it was a moment of stunned silence. They had suspected her involvement. They had theorized about the trio. They had built a strong argument. But hearing the details from one of the killers and hearing how central Suzanne had been was something else entirely. Once Christian confessed, the dominoes fell with frightening speed. Detectives brought Daniel into another room. They told him Christian had confessed. They told him the evidence was overwhelming. And they reminded him that Christian's version painted Daniel as the more violent of the two. Daniel broke down next. He confessed, though reluctantly and with more self-protection. He admitted his participation but tried to soften the brutality of his role. Still, the essential truths came out. Suzanne had initiated the plan. She had cut ties with her parents emotionally months earlier. She wanted money and freedom. She played the role of strategist, not executioner. When detectives finally confronted Suzanne, she was composed, at least initially. But it didn't last long. She tried to deny the accusations, insisting that Christian and Daniel were lying to avoid responsibility. But investigators presented details that only someone inside the house could know. And then, the final blow. "Christian told us you were awake in the hallway while your parents were being killed." Her reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A small tremor in her hands, a break in eye contact, the collapse of her carefully controlled expression. For the first time, she realized the truth was out. The facade was shattered, and she was no longer protected by her own lies. She didn't confess fully in the same clear way the brothers did, but her denials became inconsistent, confused, and filled with contradictions. Her calm demeanor vanished. Detectives didn't need a confession anymore. They had the truth, and they had it documented. Within hours, all three were officially detained, and Brazil, the entire country, would never forget what happened next. The public reaction and moral shock. When news of the confessions reached the public, Brazil erupted. It was one of the most shocking reactions to a crime in modern Brazilian history, because it wasn't just a double homicide. It wasn't just another high-profile crime. It was the betrayal of a kind that most people consider unimaginable. A daughter, wealthy, privileged, educated, loved, involved in planning the murder of her own parents. The nation struggled to process it. Television stations interrupted regular programming to cover updates. Radio programs debated motives, morality, and psychological profiles. Newspapers printed front-page headlines that sounded almost surreal, and the public was glued to every new revelation. Several elements amplified the shock. 1. Suzanne's social status. Unlike many famous crimes tied to poverty, domestic disputes, or desperation, this case involved a girl from an upper-class family living in luxury with every opportunity at her fingertips. The public struggled to understand why. What was missing from her life? What could possibly justify such a betrayal? 2. Her demeanor. During interviews, Suzanne's calmness, composure, and lack of visible grief disturbed many Brazilians. People watched her behavior closely. Her body language, her tone of voice, the way she interacted with Daniel, her absence of emotional collapse. It didn't match the image of a grieving daughter. It matched the profile of someone hiding something, and later someone who simply didn't care. 3. The boyfriend's involvement. The idea that a romantic relationship could lead to this level of manipulation, codependency, and moral collapse fascinated the media. It became a tragic symbol of how personal dynamics can turn toxic. 4. The brutality of the crime. The murder wasn't quick or distant. It wasn't done with a gunshot from afar. It required proximity, physical force, and repetition. Blunt force trauma. Dozens of blows. The brutality made the crime feel personal, even though the killers were not the victim's family members. And knowing Suzanne was present in the hallway made it even worse. 5. The motives, freedom, and inheritance. That combination was deeply unsettling to society. It implied no desperation, no mental breakdown, no self-defense, no sudden rage. Instead, it suggested calculation. 6. The planning. The weeks of preparation, the calm deception, the staged robbery, the deliberate manipulation. All of this contributed to the narrative that this was more than a crime. It was a betrayal of trust at the deepest possible level. The media portrayal television networks followed every detail. Psychologists were invited to speculate on her personality. Reporters repeated footage of her walking calmly through police corridors, her expression controlled and cold. Shows interviewed neighbors, friends, former classmates, all trying to piece together a puzzle that made little emotional sense. Even the crime reenactments shown by police became iconic and horrifying to the public. Public division. Most Brazilians reacted with disgust, outrage, and disbelief. But some were strangely fascinated by Suzanne. Her appearance, her mannerisms, her intelligence, her ability to deceive so effectively. The case triggered a broader conversation about the dark side of privilege, the psychology of manipulation, the nature of greed, the fragility of family bonds, how someone raised in a loving home could turn so violently against it. The public wasn't just angry, they were morally shaken. For many, it felt like the kind of crime that shouldn't be possible. And yet, it happened. The legal system reacts with confessions in hand and overwhelming forensic evidence. Prosecutors acted quickly. They filed charges for double qualified homicide for reasons considered vile with no possibility for defense, and with premeditation, the legal machinery began turning fast. And for the first time since the night of the crime, Suzanne found herself in a position she couldn't control. No charm, no lies, and no facade could reverse what had already happened. Her new reality was a prison cell. When the police formally detained the trio, something subtle but extremely revealing happened. The relationship between the three began to fracture almost immediately. For months, they had maintained a united front built on secrecy, shared guilt, and mutual dependency. But once separated into different cells, interviewed independently, and left alone with their thoughts, the illusion of unity dissolved. Suzanne's initial days in custody. In the first hours after her detention, officers noticed something striking about her behavior. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't crying uncontrollably. She wasn't begging for answers or calling out for her parents. Instead, she displayed a type of controlled calmness that both astonished and disturbed investigators. She asked practical questions about routines, procedures, and logistics, almost as if adapting herself to the environment step by step. But beneath that calm surface, there was something else. Calculation. Prison staff would later say that she showed an almost uncanny ability to adapt socially. She was polite, articulate, aware of her surroundings, and skilled at reading people. She seemed to understand instinctively who to approach and who to avoid. Still, she wasn't isolated. Dozens of officers whispered her name as she walked past. That's the girl who helped kill her own parents. The one who planned everything. Inside the women's detention facility, news spread quickly. However, unlike what might be expected, inmates didn't treat her with hostility. Not at first. Many didn't understand the case yet. Others were curious. She was young. She was upper class. She was educated. And she seemed out of place. This combination made her a subject of fascination rather than immediate rejection. The brothers' initial reactions. Christian, having broken first during interrogation, was filled with regret and fear. In custody, he struggled emotionally and mentally. Officers noticed he had trouble sleeping and frequently appeared distraught. Daniel, on the other hand, carried himself differently. He oscillated between anger, desperation, and denial. He tried to rationalize the events, attempting to rewrite his motives in a softer way. What hurt him the most was not the accusation, but Suzanne's reaction after the arrest. Because in the weeks that followed, she began distancing herself emotionally and strategically from the Crevinos brothers. She knew the public saw her as the intellectual author of the crime. She knew prosecutors were building the case around her role. And she knew that aligning herself with Daniel and Christian would only worsen her image. The romance that had been powerful enough to fuel a murder plot now began to disintegrate. Breaking the alliance. During her early stay in prison, investigators noticed that Suzanne tried to reshape her narrative. She attempted to present herself as a manipulated young woman, pressured by Daniel, confused by emotion, and emotionally unstable. Her early statements subtly shifted blame, implying she didn't want the murder, Daniel insisted. She was emotionally controlled, and she simply made mistakes. It showed. Where Daniel stood, where Christian aimed his blows, where Suzanne waited, how the room was staged afterward, and how the trio moved throughout the home. The jury would later describe the reconstruction as chilling and impossible to ignore. Behavioral evidence. Perhaps the most controversial, yet effective on the strategy of the prosecution was their use of Suzanne's demeanor as psychological evidence. They pointed out her lack of emotional reaction, her calm delivery during interviews, her controlled expressions, her ability to cry on command, and her inconsistent grieving behavior. Some legal analysts considered this tactic questionable, but the jury was heavily influenced by it. The prosecution argued, this is someone who can perform emotion but does not feel it. And whether fair or not, this argument would have a major impact on public perception in the trial. Media pressure intensifies. While prosecutors prepared their case, the media escalated coverage to dramatic levels. Documentaries, special reports, psychological analyses, daily updates, front-page headlines. Some newspapers even published illustrated diagrams of the murder scene, showing the blows, the positions, the timeline. Suzanne's photos, taken at different stages, were plastered everywhere. Smiling in police custody, walking with calm eyes, arms crossed, head, slightly tilted hair, neatly arranged. These images fueled public anger. To many Brazilians, she didn't look like a victim of manipulation. She didn't look like a confused young girl. She looked calculating, cold, collected, detached. Some called her the coldest daughter in Brazil, the girl with the porcelain face and the iron heart. And this intense media portrayal made the work of both defense and prosecution more complex. Preparing for trial. By the end of the pre-trial phase, the evidence was overwhelming, the narrative was assembled. Public interest was at its peak, and the nation was demanding justice. The trial would become one of the most watched in Brazilian history. Cameras surrounded the courthouse, news anchors broadcast updates live. The country wasn't simply waiting for a verdict. It wanted answers to a deeper question. How could a daughter be involved in something so unthinkable? And soon the world would hear the answer, inside the courtroom. By 2006, nearly 4 years had passed since the night of the murders. The investigation was complete. The reconstruction was ready. The psychological assessments, the witness statements, the forensic reports, everything was in order. And now, the nation waited for the dramatic finale, the trial of Suzanne von Richthofen and the Cravignos brothers. It would take place in the São Paulo Court of Justice, and from the moment the date was announced, journalists from across the country gathered outside the building. Cameras, lights, microphones. The courthouse steps looked more like the entrance to a film premiere than the site of a double homicide trial. Public curiosity had not faded with time. If anything, it had grown. Because the more Brazilians learned, the more fascinated and horrified they became. Suzanne was no longer just a suspect or a young woman accused of a serious crime. She had become a national symbol of moral collapse, a stage of drama and strategy. The trial was a public event, though heavily controlled. Seats for spectators were limited, but hundreds gathered outside, waiting for updates. Commentators on television analyzed every detail. The expressions of the defendants, the arguments expected from both sides, the psychological evaluations, the possible outcomes, the moral implications. The prosecution came prepared with a strong narrative. A daughter who betrayed her parents for money, freedom, and a forbidden romance. The defense, on the other hand, had one main goal: to reframe Suzanne as vulnerable, manipulated, emotionally abused, and incapable of orchestrating the crime. Both strategies would collide head-on in the courtroom. The entrance of the defendants. On the first day of the trial, the crowd outside surged toward the barricades as the police vehicles arrived. First to enter was Daniel Cravignos, looking tense and visibly aged by the years in custody. His eyes were dark, his movements subdued. Gone was the boy with rebellious confidence. Now he looked like someone haunted by regret. Next came Christian, quieter and more withdrawn. His confession had changed him. Many said he carried a profound emotional burden, not only for the crime itself, but for being the first to expose the truth. And finally, Suzanne. She stepped out of the police vehicle wearing a modest outfit chosen specifically to appear humble and delicate. A soft sweater, no makeup, hair tied back. The goal was clear: appear innocent, appear fragile, appear remorseful. But the moment she walked toward the entrance, the crowd erupted. Shouts of anger, cries of disgust, people calling her heartless, soulless, cruel. She didn't respond. She kept her head down, eyes fixed on the ground, hands tightly bound together. But observers noted a certain composure, a quiet, almost detached calm, as if she had prepared herself mentally for the storm. Inside the courtroom. Once inside, Suzanne sat between two officers, separated from Daniel and Christian. This physical distance reflected the emotional and strategic divide that had developed between them over the previous years. For the first time in a long time, the three faced each other. Daniel looked at her, his expression mixed with longing and bitterness. Christian avoided eye contact entirely, and Suzanne didn't turn her head once. Whatever bond had once united them was gone. Opening statements. The prosecution began with a powerful introduction. The crime was premeditated. It was the result of greed. It was carried out with cruelty. And Suzanne was the intellectual mastermind behind it. They painted her as a strategist who manipulated Daniel and Christian for her own gain. Then the defense responded. They argued Suzanne was psychologically fragile. Daniel exerted emotional control over her. She acted under pressure, influence, and youthful confusion, and her involvement, while wrong, was not one of a cold, calculating killer. The battle lines were drawn. With the opening statements complete, the heart of the trial began. Witness testimony and forensic evidence. The crime scene specialists. The prosecution's first witnesses were forensic experts who had examined the house. They testified about blood patterns, the position of the bodies, the killer's trajectory, the number of blows, and the staged robbery. They demonstrated that nothing was truly stolen. The drawers were tossed intentionally, the break-in signs were artificial, and the crime had been meticulously staged. The jury listened in silence as photos were shown. Photos of the bedroom, the bed soaked with blood, the walls stained by impact, and the metal bars used in the attack. One juror later said these images were impossible to forget. The psychological evaluation psychologist testified next, offering a clinical analysis of Suzanne's personality. They described her as intelligent, articulate, socially skilled, capable of manipulation, emotionally detached, and highly calculating. This testimony became one of the most controversial parts of the trial. Her defense protested, arguing that personality traits should not define guilt. But the prosecution insisted that understanding her psychological profile was crucial to understanding intent. And the jury seemed to agree. The testimony that shocked the country. Several witnesses provided emotional testimony. Friends of the family, former employees, teachers, neighbors. Many described Manfred and Maricia as loving parents, strict, yes, but caring and devoted to their children. Some spoke of the tension surrounding Suzanne's relationship with Daniel, confirming that her parents had disapproved not because of social prejudice, but because they felt Daniel was irresponsible and drew Suzanne away from school and family values. Each witness reinforced the image of a family that did not deserve the fate that befell them. Daniel and Christian testify. When the Cravignos brothers took the stand, the courtroom became electric. Christian's testimony. He repeated what he had already confessed. The plan, the staging, the execution, and Suzanne's role in everything. His voice trembled at times, especially when describing the blows. He said he regretted his actions deeply. Daniel's testimony. Daniel, more composed, tried to soften his own involvement. He admitted the crime, yes, but also insisted he acted out of a twisted sense of love for Suzanne. He stated, "I would have done anything for her. I thought we were creating a future together." But he also accused her of being the one who insisted on the murder. Suzanne takes the stand. Finally, the moment everyone waited for arrived. Suzanne stood to testify. The courtroom fell silent. Her voice was controlled and soft. She maintained a sympathetic posture, hands held together, gaze lowered, the image of a delicate young woman overwhelmed by events. She claimed she never truly wanted her parents dead. Daniel pressured her. She was emotionally manipulated. She was confused and lost. The prosecution confronted her with contradictions. Earlier statements, evidence witness accounts her calm behavior during the crime. Her presence in the hallway under pressure, she contradicted herself multiple times. Her narrative shifted depending on the question. Observers noted that unlike Daniel and Christian, her testimony seemed rehearsed, carefully constructed, but lacking emotional authenticity. One prosecutor later said, "She could cry on command, but not when it mattered." After days of testimony, arguments, and evidence, the moment of truth arrived. The jury began deliberations. Outside, the crowd had grown to hundreds, all waiting for the verdict. Hours passed, and then the doors opened. The sentences are read. The judge entered the courtroom. The defendant stood. Cameras outside went live. The entire country held its breath. Daniel Cravignos guilty, sentenced to 39 years and 6 months in prison. Christian Cravignos guilty, sentenced to 38 years and 6 months in prison. And then, the most anticipated decision, Suzanne Louise von Richthofen, guilty of double qualified homicide with aggravating factors of premeditation, cruel method, inability for the victims to defend themselves, and moral responsibility for orchestrating the crime sentence, 39 years and 6 months in prison. The reactions. Daniel. He lowered his head, devastated. The woman he once loved had just received the same sentence as him, the woman he believed he had sacrificed everything for. Christian. He remained silent, accepting the consequences of his actions. Suzanne. Her reaction surprised the court. She didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she simply blinked, swallowed, and nodded, as though she had expected it all along. Some said it was composure. Others said it was coldness. Many believed it was confirmation of what psychologists had described. Outside the courthouse. When officers escorted her outside, the crowd erupted in anger, shouting insults, accusations, and condemnations. Police had to form a protective barrier around the vehicle. Reporters described the scene as explosive, chaotic, and unlike anything seen before. The end of the trial. The trial was over, but the story of Suzanne von Richthofen was far from finished. The next chapters would follow her, Through the prison system, through media attention, through attempts at education and redemption, through relationships formed behind bars, and through the many controversies that erupted in the following years. Because even after her sentencing, one fact remained. Brazil could not stop talking about Suzane, and the years to come would only intensify this strange, disturbing fascination. Media frenzy, public outrage, and a nation divided. As investigators solidified the chain of events, the case was no longer just a police matter. It became a national spectacle. The murder of the Richthofen couple already sounded like something out of a grim novel. An upper-class home, a wealthy and respected family, and a crime executed with brutal efficiency. But what truly ignited the public's fascination was the unlikely mastermind at the center. A daughter as the prime suspect. The idea that Suzane, the smiling, well-educated, apparently affectionate daughter, could be responsible for the death of her own parents shattered the Brazilian public's expectations of what a murderer looked like. She didn't fit the stereotype. She wasn't a criminal from the margins of society. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't under threat. She was a young woman with every opportunity, and according to investigators, she had thrown it all away for money, freedom, and a boyfriend. News outlets explored every angle they could find: her personality, her relationship with Daniel, her academic record, her personal habits, her demeanor during questioning, even the way she dressed during public appearances. For days, every morning show, afternoon talk show, and nightly news report carried updates about the case. Public opinion split into two broad camps, but both sides were united by the same emotion: shock. The Ice Princess image. As time went on, the media turned Suzane into a symbol, and not a flattering one. Reporters and commentators coined terms like the coldest daughter Brazil has ever seen, the girl without tears, the Ice Princess, the Richthofen heiress killer. Her calm, almost detached behavior in the early days fueled those perceptions. Even when she cried, newspapers questioned whether it was genuine. She became, in media terms, the perfect villain, a shocking contrast between appearance and accusation. Newspapers and magazines featured her on covers for months. Her courtroom appearances were broadcast live. Every gesture, every look, every word was dissected in real time. The Cravinhos brothers' role in the narrative. While Suzane was the center of attention, Daniel and Christian also became household names. But the media painted them differently. Daniel was the bad influence, the boyfriend who helped her rebel. Christian was the accomplice who claimed he only participated because his brother asked him to. Still, even in this triangle, the public narrative kept gravitating back toward Suzane. She was the wealthy one. She stood to inherit everything. She was the one who let the killers back into the house. Speculation, opinions, and a national obsession. At this point, the case had transformed into a broader cultural conversation. People debated, was this greed? Was it manipulation? Was it psychological disturbance? Was she under Daniel's influence? Or was Daniel under her influence? TV programs hosted psychologists to analyze her body language. Commentators argued about the true motive. Talk shows asked viewers whether they believed she could still inherit the family fortune. Tabloids invented theories and speculations. The case had all the elements of a shocking drama, but it was tragically real. A nation searching for meaning. What truly disturbed people wasn't only the murder itself, it was the why. The complete lack of necessity, the betrayal of the most fundamental social bond, that of a child toward their parents. Many people ask themselves, how could someone do this? Could this happen in my family? What kind of person kills the very people who raised them? It tapped into a primal fear. The idea that sometimes evil doesn't come from outside, but from within a home. By the time the police concluded their investigation and sent the case to the public prosecutor's office, the country was already fully invested. Everyone wanted to know what would come next. Psychological evaluations and the question of motive. As the case moved closer to trial, a crucial challenge emerged, determining why the murder happened. The search for a motive. Investigators had already compiled the operational details of the crime. The planning, the weapon, The timeline, the roles of each participant, the attempt to stage a robbery, the lies told to police. But the psychological dimension still needed to be explored. After all, this was not a crime born from impulse. It was premeditated. So the court ordered detailed psychological and psychiatric evaluations of all three defendants. Suzanne's evaluation. Over several sessions, specialists assessed her personality traits, her behavior, and her emotional responses. Reports later described egocentrism, emotional coldness under pressure, high capacity for manipulation, difficulty accepting responsibility, strong influence from the relationship with Daniel. However, the professionals emphasized something extremely important. She was not mentally ill. She understood what she was doing. She knew it was wrong. She acted with full awareness. This became fundamental for the prosecution. Daniel's evaluation psychologists found him to be easily influenced by strong personalities, emotionally dependent on Suzanne, immature, impulsive. But also fully aware of his actions, reports suggested the relationship between the two created a feedback loop. She provided direction, he provided execution. Christian's evaluation. Christian's assessments showed he had a more passive role. He appeared emotionally dependent on his brother and lacked assertiveness. But again, he was fully responsible for his actions. The final motive. According to the prosecutors, the official narrative presented to the court was built on three interconnected motives. Financial interest. Suzanne would inherit a large estate and gain control of family assets. Desire for total freedom. Her parents restricted her relationship with Daniel and enforced discipline at home. Emotional dependence on Daniel. Their relationship created an us versus the world dynamic that intensified the planning. But something else became clear. There was no single, logical, rational reason that could justify such an act. It was an intersection of greed, manipulation, emotional immaturity, and fantasy. And that complexity is precisely what has kept this case alive in public memory for decades. With the psychological reports completed and the evidence organized, the next stage of the process began: preparing for trial. By now, the case of Suzanne von Richthofen was no longer just a crime investigation. It had evolved into a national obsession, a cultural event, and everyone, from experts to ordinary citizens, had an opinion. Legal teams shape their narratives. Each defendant's lawyer knew that the trial would be heavily influenced not only by facts, but by the emotional impact of the presentation. For the prosecution, the narrative was straightforward: greed, manipulation, premeditation, cold-blooded execution, a daughter who violated the most sacred human bond. For the defense, things were more complicated. Suzanne's defense strategy. Her lawyers faced a unique challenge. How do you defend someone who has already confessed, someone the entire country perceives as the mastermind? The defense considered several angles. Blamed Daniel portraying Suzanne as young, naive, manipulated, emotionally dependent. Emphasize emotional fragility, suggesting she was overwhelmed and not thinking clearly. Minimize premeditation, framing the crime as something that got out of control. Humanize her. Show her as a vulnerable young woman, not a monster. But they knew the public was hostile. Any misstep could strengthen the prosecution's argument. Daniel and Christian's defense. Daniel's lawyers intended to use the opposite strategy. Emphasize Suzanne's dominant personality. Claim that she pressured him, paint him as emotionally controlled by her, suggest that he wasn't the mastermind, only the executor. Christian's team leaned even more heavily on the idea of influence. Christian didn't plan anything. He was loyal to his brother. He participated only out of fear or pressure. He regretted everything, but the prosecution had a powerful counter-argument. Regardless of personality, each of them delivered blows that killed Manfred and Marisia, and they all knew exactly what they were doing. The public prepares for the trial. In the weeks leading up to the court date, anticipation reached its peak. TV stations filmed around the courthouse. Newspapers interviewed psychologists, lawyers, and criminologists. Every new image of Suzanne, wearing glasses, a ponytail, a soft expression, became front-page material. Opinion polls showed that public sentiment was overwhelmingly against her. A question echoed everywhere. Would the jury be influenced by the media? The defense feared this. The prosecution counted on it. The trial begins. A courtroom under the spotlight. On the morning of the trial, crowds gathered outside the courthouse before sunrise. Curiosity, anger, fascination, all emotions mixed in the air. TV channels ran live coverage, narrating every detail. What Suzanne wore, her body language. The Trevino's brothers. Expressions, comments from spectators. Predictions from legal experts. It felt less like a trial and more like a national broadcast event. First impressions. Inside the courtroom. When the defendants entered, the atmosphere shifted. The families of the victims were on one side. Spectators and journalists filled the rest of the room. Suzanne appeared calm, wearing simple clothing and glasses. Daniel looked tense but defiant. Christian seemed the most nervous, glancing down frequently. Everything, posture, eye contact, tone of voice, was observed. Opening statements. The prosecution opened with a powerful, emotionally charged speech emphasizing the brutality of the crime, the betrayal of parental trust, the greed behind the motive, the calculated planning, the coldness shown afterward. The prosecutor described the killings in chilling detail, ensuring the jury felt the weight of what happened. He ended with a line that would be replayed on TV for days. This was not just murder. This was the annihilation of a family from the inside. The defense response, Suzanne's defense team, attempted to soften her image, highlighting her youth, suggesting emotional manipulation by Daniel, claiming she acted under pressure and confusion, pointing to her cooperation after confessing. It was a difficult argument, especially since the evidence suggested she was deeply involved in the planning. Daniel's defense tried a different tone, painting him as emotionally unstable, emphasizing his dependence on Suzanne. Insinuating. She led the plan and he followed. Christian's defense focused on minimization. He acted under his brother's influence. He had no initiative of his own. He didn't strike the fatal blows, though evidence contradicted this. Still, the prosecution's case seemed more cohesive and powerful. Witnesses, forensic analysis, and the weight of the evidence. As the trial moved to witness testimony, the prosecution called the people whose voices mattered most. Forensic experts take the stand. Specialists described the angle of the strikes, the force used, the defensive wounds, the blood patterns, the position of the bodies. They explained that the victims had tried to defend themselves, especially Mauricia, and that the attack was deliberate, methodical, and impossible to interpret as spontaneous. Each detail deepened the horror. Investigators' testimonies. Police officers detailed the inconsistencies in the robbery, staging Suzanne's unusual behavior. The way the Trevino's brothers immediately cracked under interrogation, the eventual confessions. They also described how the stories aligned once the facade fell apart, something that reinforced premeditation. Family and acquaintances, friends and relatives testified briefly about the Richthofen family dynamics. The parents' disapproval of Daniel Manfred's attempts to limit the relationship, Suzanne's growing rebellion. While not direct evidence, these testimonies helped the prosecution establish motive. The psychological experts. Their reports were crucial. They made it clear that none of the defendants were mentally ill. All were fully capable of understanding the crime. There was intent, awareness, and planning. This neutralized any attempt to use emotional disturbances as a defense. When defendants speak, contradictions, blame, and cold details. Eventually, it was time for the defendants to speak. Suzanne takes the stand. Her testimony was calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. Observers noted how she rarely displayed strong emotion. She admitted involvement but minimized her responsibility. She said she felt pressured. She claimed she didn't fully understand what would happen. She blamed Daniel for pushing the plan forward. She portrayed herself as confused and overwhelmed, but under cross-examination, contradictions appeared. She had helped plan the timing. She had unlocked the house. She had turned off the alarm. She had hidden with the killers afterward. She had slept in the house after the murders. The prosecution's questions were merciless. If you didn't want your parents to die, why didn't you stop it? Why did you open the door? Why did you share money with the killers afterward? There were no convincing answers. Daniel's testimony. Daniel's testimony contradicted hers in several places. He claimed Suzanne insisted on the plan. She was determined to remove her parents as obstacles. She had emotional control over him. He participated because she made him believe it was the only solution. His words intensified the image of a toxic, mutually destructive relationship. Christian's testimony. Christian tried to portray himself as the least guilty. He followed Daniel. He didn't plan anything. He didn't strike the final blows, but the forensic evidence didn't support these claims. He had blood on his clothes. He moved objects in the house. He helped stage the robbery. His attempt to appear uninvolved did not convince the jury. Closing arguments, the verdict, and the sentencing. After days of emotional testimony, forensic explanations, and contradictory statements, the trial neared its end. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, a mixture of expectation, fatigue, and the lingering horror of the details that had been revealed. The judge invited both sides to deliver their final arguments. These would be the last words spoken before the jury deliberated on the fate of the three defendants. The prosecution's closing argument. The lead prosecutor stood before the jurors with a stack of papers he barely looked at. He didn't need them. He knew this case inside and out. His voice was calm, but every sentence carried weight. He reminded the jury of the brutality of the crime. 2 parents murdered while defenseless, multiple blows delivered with intent to kill. Planning that removed any doubt of spontaneity, actions taken after the murder to simulate a robbery, lies told repeatedly to police. Then he turned his focus to motive. He described how Suzanne stood to inherit substantial wealth. Daniel wanted the lifestyle that money could provide. Christian followed for loyalty and financial gain, and together, they formed a deadly alliance fueled by greed and entitlement. The most powerful moment came when he spoke directly about the symbolic nature of the crime. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, every society depends on the sanctity of the family. When a daughter helps kill her own parents, she doesn't just break the law, she breaks the moral foundation that holds us together. He paused, letting silence settle over the room. This was not passion, not impulse, not confusion. This was choice. His final request to the jury was simple. Honor the victims. Honor justice. Convict them. The defense's final attempt. Despite the crushing pressure from public opinion and the prosecution's cohesive narrative, the defense still had the right to speak. Suzanne's defense. Her team argued she was young and impressionable. Daniel exerted psychological influence over her. She acted under emotional distress. She was not the one who delivered the fatal blows. Her cooperation and confession demonstrated remorse, but the points felt weak compared to the evidence. The jury had heard too many details of planning, too many choices, too many actions she took willingly. Daniel's defense. Daniel's lawyer attempted a bold approach. He framed Daniel as emotionally unstable, claimed he was manipulated by love, suggested he had been consumed by a fantasy of freedom, tried to minimize his role as an executor, not a thinker. But this argument had a fatal flaw. The brutality of the attack was undeniable. Christian's defense. Christian's lawyer emphasized his lesser involvement, his dependence on his brother, his supposed regret, his lack of initiative in the planning. But again, the forensic evidence showed he participated directly. He helped kill 2 people and helped stage the scene. The jury deliberates. After closing arguments, the courtroom fell into a thick, heavy silence. The jury withdrew to deliberate. The room emptied somewhat, but tension remained. Outside, crowds gathered around TVs and radios. News networks switched into full breaking news mode. Commentators speculated on every possible outcome. Inside the courthouse, the judge, lawyers, journalists, and spectators waited, sometimes pacing, sometimes whispering, sometimes sitting in anxious stillness. Hours passed. People wondered, would the jury be influenced by the media pressure? Would they believe the defendant showed remorse? Would they consider the psychological evaluations? Would the court accept the narrative that Daniel influenced Suzanne, or that she manipulated him? When the doors finally opened, every camera in the building turned toward the hallway. The jury had reached a verdict. The verdict: a nation holds its breath. The defendants were called back into the courtroom. Suzanne sat with her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Daniel looked defiant but pale. Christian shifted nervously, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The judge asked the jury foreperson to rise. The verdicts were read one by one. For Suzanne Louise von Richthofen, guilty. Guilty of double homicide with aggravating circumstances. Motivation considered base, vile use of cruel methods. Crime committed against ascendant's parents. For Daniel Cravignos, guilty. Guilty of double homicide, fully responsible for the killing of both victims. For Christian Cravignos, guilty. Guilty of participating in and facilitating the double homicide. There was no shock, no gasp, just a collective exhale from the courtroom. Everyone had expected this outcome, but hearing it officially still carried weight. Sentencing: severe punishment for a severe crime. The judge, now responsible for determining the sentences, delivered one of the most memorable speeches in Brazilian criminal history. He spoke about the sanctity of the family bond, the brutality of the murders, the greed behind the motive, the chilling level of planning, the emotional coldness displayed afterward, the symbolic impact the case had on society. His conclusion was clear: the crime was among the most shocking and morally repugnant in the nation's history. The sentences. The judge pronounced 39 years and 6 months for Suzanne, 39 years and 6 months for Daniel, 38 years and 6 months for Christian. The severity of the punishment reflected not only the legal implications, but also the moral outrage of the crime. Aftermath, family media, and the fragmented legacy. The verdict closed one chapter of the story, but the aftermath was its own narrative. Public reaction. Across Brazil, people reacted with a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief. Many felt justice had been served. Others questioned whether the media had influenced the jury. But almost everyone agreed on one thing: this crime would never be forgotten. The surviving family. The remaining members of the Richthofen family were devastated. The murders had not only taken Manfred and Maricia, but had effectively shattered their entire lineage. A daughter convicted of killing her parents, a future destroyed, a family name forever linked to tragedy. Legacy in the media documentaries, interviews, films, books, and countless discussions would continue for decades. The name von Richthofen became a symbol, not of wealth or prestige, but of betrayal and horror. The crime became a reference point in conversations about family violence, greed, psychological manipulation, premeditated homicide, the darker side of human nature. It seared itself into Brazilian cultural history. Prison life, transformation, controversies, and unexpected twists. After the sentencing, the doors of the courtroom closed behind the defendants. But the story was far from over. For many high-profile cases, media attention fades as soon as the verdict is delivered. But this case was different. The imprisonment of Suzanne von Richthofen, Daniel Cravignos, and Christian Cravignos opened an entirely new chapter, one that would be marked by twists, scandals, and constant public scrutiny. Suzanne's first years in prison. Suzanne was sent to the Tremembe Women's Penitentiary, one of the most well-known prisons in São Paulo. It housed detainees from vastly different backgrounds, including notorious criminals. And it was not a gentle environment for someone who had lived a privileged life. Adapting to a harsh reality. In the early months, she kept a low profile, avoided conflicts, spent much of her time reading, rarely interacted with others. Inmates and guards reported that she was polite, contained, and generally quiet. Her behavior was described as disciplined, even meticulous. Yet beneath this adaptation was a profound isolation. For the first time in her life, she was completely disconnected from the world she once knew. Family visits were rare. Friends gave no sign of support. The name von Richthofen was now a curse, a reminder of a crime that horrified the country, the question of her inheritance. One of the earliest legal battles after the trial was whether Suzanne maintained the right to inherit her parents' estate. Civil courts ruled that a person cannot inherit from the people they murdered. Therefore, she was legally excluded from any inheritance. The estate was transferred to her younger brother, Andreas. This decision symbolically severed the last tie between Suzanne and the family she had destroyed. Daniel and Christian, life behind bars. The Crevignos brothers entered the men's penitentiary system with sentences almost as long as Suzanne's. Their reputations followed them inside. Daniel's behavior. In prison, Daniel showed strong adaptability, ability to socialize, a calm, controlled attitude. He spent long periods working, studying, or exercising. Unlike Suzanne, who retreated inward, Daniel integrated into prison life with a sense of structure. Christian's behavior. Christian was more reserved. He was quiet. He avoided conflicts. He kept to himself more than Daniel. Given his personality, the prison environment was intimidating, but he managed to avoid major altercations. Media continues following their lives. Even behind bars, the trio remained under public scrutiny. Every small change in their routines, jobs, transfers, relationships, became news. Journalists camped outside the prison gates on holidays to check who received visitors. Any administrative decision involving them, from work programs to sentence reductions, sparked heated debates. No matter how many years passed, the case still provoked strong emotions. Unexpected events, scandals, relationships, and public outrage. The next twist in the story came years later, and once again, it thrust the case back onto national headlines. A new relationship in prison. Despite the seriousness of her crime and despite the public hatred toward her, Suzanne began forming connections within the prison. At one point, she started a relationship with another inmate. The media seized on this with fervor. Photos of them together circulated, tabloids published sensational headlines. TV commentators debated whether it was appropriate for someone convicted of such a crime to experience companionship. But this was only the beginning. A surprise marriage. Eventually, Suzanne entered a long-term relationship and later married another inmate. The public reaction was severe. Many argued that someone who murdered their parents should not have the right to marry, to have relationships, or to build a new life. But legally, inmates retain certain rights, and marriage is one of them. This marriage became a symbol of the public's frustration with the penal system. They saw it as evidence that prison could offer too much freedom. The first-day release, Sidão controversy. Under Brazilian law, inmates who maintain good behavior can apply for temporary releases on holidays. The Sidões. When Suzanne became eligible, the idea of her walking freely on the streets, even temporarily, caused outrage. TV programs ran segments titled, "Should a parricide be allowed temporary release? Is the justice system too lenient? Why society cannot forgive this crime?" When she did receive permission for her first Sidão, the images of her leaving prison, wearing simple clothes, carrying a small bag, walking past reporters, triggered widespread anger. People said it was unfair. People said it was disturbing. People said justice had failed. But in reality, she was following the same legal process as thousands of inmates nationwide. Still, her case was different because the public never forgot what she had done. Daniel's release and a new chapter of controversy. Years into his sentence, Daniel Crevignos also became eligible for progression to semi-open and eventually open regimes. His release generated another media storm. Life outside prison journalists followed him, to his workplace, to his residence, to his public appearances. Any mistake, any deviation from expected behavior became a news headline. But the real shock came 1 year after he left prison. Daniel is arrested again. He was arrested for possession of illegal weapons, alleged altercations, violating conditions of his release. The exact circumstances were debated in the media, but the result was clear. Daniel returned to prison. The public responded with outraged disappointment, a sense of, "We knew this would happen." It reinforced the narrative that he was dangerous, impulsive, and incapable of living within society's rules. Christian later progressed to semi-liberty as well, though without the same level of publicity. Suzanne's evolution from infamy to quiet routine. Years continued to pass. Prison, ironically, brought Suzanne stability. She completed academic courses, earned work privileges, became known for disciplined behavior, avoided conflicts, focused on religious activities, built friendships with select inmates. Some saw this as genuine change, others saw it as strategic, a calculated attempt to reduce her sentence. How the inmates saw her. Surprisingly, reports suggest many inmates treated her normally. To them, she wasn't a celebrity. She was someone who made a terrible choice but was now living the same reality they were. Prison equalized everyone. The long road to freedom. After nearly 2 decades behind bars, something happened that many thought would never arrive. Suzanne became eligible for parole. The news broke like an explosion in the media. Talk shows reignited the debate. Should someone who murdered their parents be allowed to reintegrate into society? Is the justice system too forgiving? Has she changed, or is this just procedure? To many, the idea of her living a normal life felt wrong, but the law is the law. The conditions of release. Upon approval, she would need to follow strict guidelines, regular check-ins, defined residence itinerary limitations, employment or study, no media contracts without authorization. Even so, the very concept of her walking freely stirred intense emotional reactions. When parole was granted, it marked the beginning of one of the final chapters in this long and painful narrative: the media frenzy and the national obsession. The trial of Suzanne von Richthofen was not just a legal procedure. It became a spectacle, one of the most explosive media events in Brazilian history. And to understand why, you have to imagine the perfect storm forming around the case. A wealthy family, a cold-blooded crime, a daughter accused of orchestrating her own parents' murder, a boyfriend from a socially distant background, a crime committed inside a mansion in an upscale neighborhood, and, above all, the contrast between Suzanne's soft-spoken appearance and the brutality of the act she was accused of. It was a case built for the media, and the media devoured it. The cameras, the headlines, and the public shock. Every day, newspapers printed something new. Interviews, theories, speculation, leaks, psychological analyses, and even fashion commentary about what Suzanne was wearing when she appeared in public. Television programs began running specials, analyzing every detail of her demeanor. To the public, she became a symbol, either of manipulation, wickedness, or tragedy, depending on who was watching. But most importantly, she became impossible to ignore. Even people who rarely followed crime stories knew her name. Some news programs replayed courtroom footage repeatedly, analyzing her body language. Did she show remorse? Did she smile too much? Was she crying sincerely? Was she cold? Every gesture became a debate. Every silence became a headline. The contrast of narratives. Daniel and Christian Cravinhos were often portrayed as the brutal executors. Physically strong, intense, almost stereotyped as the dangerous outsiders who carried out the violent part of the crime. Suzanne, meanwhile, was portrayed as the intellectual mastermind, the one who planned, calculated, and emotionally manipulated the situation to her advantage. The press was fascinated by this duality: beauty and brutality, romance and murder, privilege and cruelty. And this contrast, once amplified on television, cemented the case in national memory. The court of public opinion. Long before the trial reached its conclusion, the public had already formed opinions. Some believed Suzanne was the center of everything, a cold and selfish mastermind. Others argued she had been manipulated by Daniel, swept into a toxic relationship. But most Brazilians felt something stronger: betrayal. The idea of a child killing their own parents violated something deeply ingrained in the collective imagination. Even people who normally tried to understand the why behind crimes found themselves emotionally reacting to this case. And when the news revealed additional details, such as the inheritance dispute, the shopping trip the next day, and the planned alibi, the public outrage only intensified. The trial begins. When the trial finally began, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters, onlookers, and curious crowds hoping to catch a glimpse of Suzanne or the Cravinhos brothers. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecution painted a picture of manipulation, greed, and premeditation. The defense attempted to frame Suzanne as emotionally fragile and heavily influenced by Daniel. But what truly shocked observers were the details retold in open court: the brutality of the crime, the methodical planning, and the unsettling lack of hesitation described in the testimonies. Jurors watched hours of footage, listened to expert witnesses, and heard the siblings speak. At times, the courtroom was so silent that even the clicking of cameras outside could be faintly heard. Suzanne's behavior under scrutiny. Every movement she made was debated. When she cried, was it genuine or strategic? When she whispered to her lawyers, what was she saying? When she looked down, was it humility or avoidance? When she looked up, was it defiance? Forensic psychologists were interviewed on television, giving lengthy analyses of her personality, her choices, and her possible motivations. Some insisted she displayed traits consistent with manipulation. Others said she was simply emotionally immature. But regardless of expert opinion, the public already had its verdict. The guilty verdict. When the jury finally pronounced the sentence, a long prison term for Suzanne, Daniel, and Christian, the courtroom reacted audibly. Some gasped, others murmured. Outside, cameras clicked in rapid bursts as reporters fought for angles. For many Brazilians watching live, it felt like closure. Not a joyful moment, but a resolution to one of the most talked about crimes in the country's modern history. But the story didn't end there. Suzanne's time in prison would become its own chapter, filled with controversies, contradictions, permissions, punishments, and public debates about rehabilitation, justice, and morality. And that chapter is where we go next. Prison, controversy, freedom, and the legacy of a national shock. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the cameras went dark after the sentencing, a new chapter of the story began. One that, in many ways, would become almost as controversial as the crime itself. Suzanne von Richthofen had been sentenced to a long prison term for her role in the brutal murder of her own parents. Daniel and Christian Cravinhos received similar sentences, but prison would not silence the public's interest. If anything, it would intensify it. Because what happened after the verdict forced Brazilians to confront a question that still sparks debates to this day. What does justice really look like for a crime like this? Life in prison. A new world, a new image. The moment Suzanne entered the penitentiary system, the media followed every step. This was not an anonymous inmate entering a forgotten facility. This was one of the most talked about criminals in the history of the country. Inside the prison, Suzanne initially kept a low profile. Her first months were marked by isolation, partly for her safety, partly due to the sheer volume of attention surrounding her name. But soon, details of her life behind bars began to leak into newspapers. She was quiet. She studied regularly. She tried to avoid conflicts. She made few enemies and few close friends. Her behavior was described by staff as disciplined. To many people on the outside, this sounded strange. The infamous figure from headlines living an almost routine, uneventful life inside a cell. But prison in Brazil, especially for high-profile inmates, rarely remains uneventful for long. And Suzanne's case was no exception. The first great controversy, the college admission. Years after beginning her sentence, Suzanne applied for a higher education program. She was approved to study law, a decision that immediately exploded in the media. The irony was too strong for the public to ignore. A woman convicted of orchestrating the murder of her own parents. Studying law, seeking benefits that would allow her to study outside prison during the day and return at night. The outrage was immediate. Talk shows debated it. Radio hosts raged about it. Newspapers ran headlines that felt almost surreal. For many Brazilians, it felt like an insult. A reminder that the justice system sometimes seemed more flexible for those with better backgrounds or financial conditions. The online reaction turned even harsher. Social networks filled with criticism, disbelief, memes and arguments about crime, privilege, and morality. Because if someone like her could attend college outside of prison, what message did that send? The uproar eventually led to changes, restrictions, and new legal interpretations about inmates studying outside. The country's frustration was loud enough to reshape policy. The relationships inside and outside prison. While serving her sentence, Suzanne also drew attention for relationships formed while incarcerated. Reports emerged that she had begun dating someone, another inmate. Later, she became involved with a man from outside the prison, sparking headlines that felt almost like tabloids. Suzanne finds love again. Suzanne's new romance. Life as a couple, even behind bars. The details didn't matter nearly as much as the public's reaction. People argued, how could someone convicted of such a crime fall in love, build relationships, and attempt to rebuild a personal life, while her parents were gone forever? That tension between law, justice, rehabilitation, and morality would define the rest of the country's relationship with her. Because every time she smiled in a photo, every time she was shown walking into the yard with other inmates, every time a reporter asked if she was dating, the question returned. Was she suffering enough? Was she paying the price? Was this justice? Temporary leaves. The most controversial moments. Under Brazilian law, well-behaved inmates eventually qualify for temporary releases, known as saídas temporárias. And when Suzanne qualified, the news once again went national. The idea of her walking freely outside the prison, temporarily, legally, was more than many Brazilians could accept. The first time she walked out, photographers followed her relentlessly. People gathered outside. The media covered her steps in real time. Even her location became a matter of national curiosity. Where would she go? Who would she visit? What would she do with those days of freedom? Some outlets reported that she went shopping. Others claimed she visited certain neighborhoods or stores. Everything she did became headline material. For many people, seeing her outside prison, smiling, walking, breathing free air, felt like a wound reopening. Because, once again, the question rose, should someone convicted of such a brutal crime have the right to leave prison, even temporarily? The brother who cut ties. Among the few people who chose never to maintain contact with her again was her own brother, Andreas. After the murder, Andreas, who had also been inside the house on the night of the crime, distanced himself completely. Reports suggested he struggled immensely in the years after the tragedy. He refused to attend hearings where Suzanne was present. He publicly avoided speaking about her. To this day, their paths diverged permanently. And that, in a way, reinforced something deeper about the crime. The story was not only about the death of Manfred and Mauricia, it was about the destruction of an entire family. A family that, once broken, could never be rebuilt. Behavior, work, and the model inmate debate. Inside prison, staff often described Suzanne as a disciplined inmate. She worked, she studied. Her behavior was mostly compliant, but this raised another heated discussion across Brazil. Does good behavior erase the gravity of a crime? For some people, rehabilitation was an essential part of the justice system. If an inmate worked and behaved well, they deserved benefits. For others, especially those emotionally connected to the case, it didn't matter how well behaved she was, because no action inside prison could outweigh what she had done. This disagreement fueled debates for years, and every time new privileges were granted, every time she moved to a different facility, every time a new piece of information leaked, the debate came roaring back. The road to freedom. And the day it finally arrived. After many years inside the prison system and after earning the right through the legal mechanisms available to all inmates, Suzanne eventually reached the stage in which she could apply for progressão de regime, the process that transitions an inmate from closed regime to semi-open and eventually to open regime. Her release into the open regime became national news. Cameras waited outside. Reporters prepared their microphones. Her name climbed the trending topics online once again. And when she finally walked out, no longer as an inmate confined by walls, but as someone beginning the final stage of her sentence, the reactions were polarized. Some saw it as a legal inevitability. Others saw it as an injustice. Many simply felt uncomfortable, disturbed by the idea of someone convicted of such a crime returning to normal life. She later moved to a new city, took on new jobs, distanced herself from the spotlight, and attempted to rebuild her life away from cameras. But even then, the shadow of her past never fully disappeared. Because for a name as infamous as hers, anonymity is impossible. Even the simplest details, where she worked, where she lived, whether she had a new partner, became newsworthy again and again. The enduring question, can society forget? Today, many years after the crime, Brazil still discusses the case. It remains one of the most researched and referenced crimes in the country's contemporary history. Not because of morbid fascination alone, but because the case touches on themes that shake people at their core. Family, betrayal, privilege, justice, psychology, the limits of rehabilitation, the power of the media, and behind all of this, one simple, painful truth. A couple, respected, hardworking, dedicated to their children, lost their lives in the most brutal and unexpected way possible. And the person responsible for orchestrating it was the one they trusted most. Final reflection. The story that never really ends. As we close this story, one thing becomes clear. This is not just a crime, not just a trial, not just a prison sentence. It is a scar on a family, on a society, and on an entire generation that watched the case unfold in real time. Suzanne von Richthofen lives her life today outside prison walls. Legally, she served the time the justice system assigned to her. But public opinion, that's different. Public opinion has its own kind of sentence, one that never truly ends. And every time her name resurfaces, every time a documentary is made, every time a headline mentions her, every time someone remembers the tragedy, the same question returns. How do you move forward from a crime like this? And can anyone, society, family, or even the perpetrator, ever truly be free from the weight of it? Because in the end, some stories don't fade. Some stories mark a nation. And this one will be remembered for generations. If you found this story informative and want to see more cases from around the world, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing detailed, responsible true crime content to you. Thank you for watching and stay safe.